Okay, lovely. All right, we're recording and I'm going to admit everyone now.
Here they come. I feel like waving to everybody. Hi, everyone.
Hello. Right. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Welcome to this evening's Avid Reader Zoom session. We have Avid Reader darling and local author Cass Moriarty in conversation with the fantastic Kayte Nunn tonight, and they will be discussing Kayte's novel, The Silk House. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently broadcasting to you from, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Before I hand you over to Cass, I'd just first like to reiterate some of the information that I mentioned in the email that you were sent with the link to tonight's event. So you've all been placed on mute automatically, and you'll remain so until the end of the event when I'll unmute you all so that you can say, join me in thanking Cass and Kayte for tonight's discussion. But we will have time for questions at the end of the event, and if you would like to ask Kayte a question, you can do so via the chat box. All of them will come directly to me, and I'll read them out as soon as Cass prompts me to do so, which will probably be at about 7:15. So with that all said, I will now hand you over to Cass so that she can introduce you to Kayte and we can begin the evening. So Cass, over to you.
Thank you, Emma Kate. Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight from wherever you are. I would like to also begin by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yagara people, the traditional owners of this land in Brisbane, where I'm zooming in from tonight. And I acknowledge that each of you in Australia is on land belonging to other Indigenous groups, and that wherever you are, stories have been told and celebrated for thousands of years, just as we're doing tonight. And we recognise all elders and their continuing connection to the land. Avid Reader, as you know, continues to be at the forefront of keeping the literary community connected through their online events program, but it is a tough time to be releasing a book in this COVID world. So please show your support for authors, publishers and booksellers by sharing tonight's event over social media, maybe taking a screenshot, and of course by buying many, many copies of the book at the end of the session. And Emma Kate will put up the link for that. And if you would like to keep up with the Brisbane literary mafia scene, you can tune in on the last Monday of every month as Chrissy Neen and I chat to a legendary Queensland writer and talk about some new Australian book releases. I'm so pleased to be in conversation tonight with author Kayte Nunn. Kayte is a former book and magazine editor and has published 4 previous novels, including the best-selling The Botanist's Daughter. Welcome, Kayte.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cass. Thanks for having me, Emma, and the Avid Reader.
We're so pleased you're here. Now, your new novel, The Silk House, which is behind you, but I also have a copy here, beautiful, beautiful cover, is a gothic, atmospheric, haunting mystery about botany, apothecary, textiles, witchcraft, history, superstition, and strong women. It's set in a forbidding house occupied in 1768 and used today as a school boarding house. I'll ask you in a moment to tell us a little bit about the 3 main characters that feature in the book. But firstly, could you describe the actual house that inspired this story and then tell us a little bit about the history of the Silk House in the book?
Yes, I'd love to. I first came across this particular house that the story is largely inspired by on a visit to my hometown in the county of Wiltshire about 3 years ago. And I had known this house. It was one of a number in the high street and hadn't paid it much attention. In fact, at the time, I think it was a W.H. Smith's and it had a flats above it. But when I went back 3 years ago, I discovered that it had been restored and that it was originally built as a house for a wealthy silk merchant in the town. And that immediately intrigued me. My ears pricked up and my little author senses went off. And you can now do a tour the house and the gardens, and they've restored the gardens as well. And so that was absolutely fascinating. And it's actually called, I think it's called the Merchant's House Marlborough. So there's a website for it as well. So you can go online and have a look, and they've got photographs and things there as well. It was only quite late in my writing of the book that I discovered that this house actually is thought to have been haunted, and the people who lived in the flats above before it was restored claimed that there were supernatural presence there, and that things were moved around, and they actually employed a kind of a ghostbuster to come and see what they could do to get rid of this presence. So when I read that, and I'd actually already written most of the book, I was just like, oh my goodness.
Wow.
Yes, so it really is a house that exists. And then in that same town is a prestigious boarding school, and the school has grown over the years, and it has taken over a number of buildings in the town, one of which actually is an old hotel called Ivy House, where I worked when I was about 17 or 18 in my student holidays as a chambermaid. And so I had kind of in my mind combined these two houses to create Silk House of the story that I've written.
It really does sound like they're quite similar.
Yes,
in lots of ways.
Yes, well, I mean, the high street itself, Marlborough is a very old town. It dates back to the time of King John. There are, I know that there's a pub there, and the timbers predate the Armada. And there's this kind of stuff that now blows my mind. When I was a teenager, I didn't take any notice of it whatsoever. It's just where I lived. But now, it really does surprise me. So it was that, and then I happened to be at the Victoria and Albert Museum in that same trip, and I went to my favorite gallery there, which is the costume gallery. It's beautiful. It's got examples of fashion throughout the centuries and throughout the ages, and then there was one gown that really caught my eye, and it looked like it could have been made yesterday. It was in extremely good condition, and it was woven by silk, designed by a woman I discovered called Anna Maria Garthwaite, who was one of the very few women pattern drawers at the time, because it was a man's job, and she was quite prolific, and so it was the combination of coming across a silk merchant's house in this town, and then seeing this piece of woven silk just sort of started all the cogs whirring, really.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that dress, because it sounds absolutely beautiful, and as you say, in really great condition.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about the story and the characters. So if we introduce Thea first. So Thea Rust is an Australian history teacher, newly arrived at Oxley College, and this part of the story is contemporary and set in the present day. So what's Thea's story? Tell us a bit about Thea.
She is a historian, and she studies what are known as persecuting ideologies. So she's really interested in the study of witchcraft, and she knows that this county is particularly known for incidences of witchcraft in previous centuries. So she's quite interested in visiting that area. But what really brings her to the school and to this particular job is that it happens to be her father's old school, and he was head boy there years ago, and she has quite a troubled relationship with her father, and she goes there in a sense to try and understand him, and she has a few ghosts of her own to lay to rest throughout the course of the story.
So she's the contemporary storyline, and then we have Rowan Caswell, who's a poor servant girl who lived in the late 1700s. So what's her connection to the Silk House?
She is hired by the silk merchant. There's a hiring fair called Mop Fair, and actually that fair still exists to this day, not as a hiring fair, but it's just like a carnival. The whole of the main street is shut down twice a year.
That whole hiring fair idea, I'd never heard of that before, but maybe you could explain that, because I found that fascinating.
What would happen is once or twice a year in the autumn time, I think Michaelmas, people would come from all of the villages around who needed a job that year, and they would carry the tools of their trade. So if they were a shepherd, they would have a crook. If they were a house servant, they would have a mop, which is why it was known as Mop Fair. And when they were hired, their new employer would pin a little bit of blue ribbon to their breasts to show that they'd been hired.
They've been taken.
Yes. So Rowan arrives, and she's hired by this silk merchant who is a little bit of a shady character, and he's fairly unreliable and a bit manic. And she arrives in the house as one of two maids. But she also has a few secret skills that her mother was a healer and a herbalist, and her mother has taught her a lot of those skills, so she comes with that knowledge as well.
And then the third character in the book, the third main character, is Mary Louise Stevenson. She's a pattern designer with dreams of creating beautiful fabrics. She's in the same time, around the same time period as Rowan.
Yes.
So how does she fit into the story? I guess particularly with the dress that you just mentioned.
Yes, because she lives in Spitalfields, which was a part of London that was the heart of the silk weaving industry in those times. And she lives with her sister and doesn't have a lot of money because her sister's husband has died, and she's a spinster. And she's desperate to become a silk weaver. She wants a silk designer, not a weaver, sorry. She wants that to make some money by doing so. But she gets laughed out of Spitalfields basically because it's really the province of men. And it's only when some of the apprentices start talking, and then this silk merchant arrives from the country town of Oxley, that he hears of her, and he gives her a number of commissions. And she's interested in doing things a little bit differently as well. She doesn't want to design fabrics with the kind of showy blooms that other designers are doing. She's more interested in what some people might think of as weaves, but that she knows hold a certain power.
And so the dress that you saw in the museum, that was designed by a woman, that would have been very unusual for that time.
Yes, it would have been, although this particular woman became very well known and was extremely prolific, created hundreds and hundreds of designs. But yes, it was normally men that did the designing and really, did
as with everything.
Yes.
They did everything.
Yes.
So in the book, we've got themes of, as you said, superstition, witchcraft, and some strange, unexplained occurrences throughout the story. I'm really interested in how those events were viewed by people 200 years ago versus how we might rationalise them today. And you sort of explore that in your story too, because you've got the 1700s storyline and then you've got the contemporary storyline. So how do the different characters in your story relate to those sort of inexplicable events? I don't want you to give any spoilers, but how do people rationalise, what might happen as opposed to how they might have explained it 200 years ago?
Yes, I think 200 years ago, people were an awful lot more superstitious, definitely, and believed much more in the inexplicable. Whereas I think contemporary life, people expect an answer and want to know that there's a rational reason for things. Even if they're, just slightly in the back of their mind, they might be thinking, oh, well, maybe there is something that I don't know about. I'm quite superstitious, but I'm not sure I believe in ghosts. So I'm on the fence there. When I was writing this, I would scare myself a bit. And I'd lie in bed at night and hear footsteps thundering up and down the hallway because we live in an old weatherboard cottage at the moment. And my daughters are convinced that there's a ghost in this house and they've given her a name, but they did like to scare me. But I had that feeling when I was writing it, and I hope the reader has that slight feeling that they're just looking over their shoulder slightly to think, oh, what's going on? But yeah, look, generally people in the 1700s sort of and times before were a lot less educated generally, and so old beliefs were really important to them, and if they couldn't explain things, well, that's when people started to be blamed for things that were inexplicable, exactly. Or blamed for disease or crops failing or animals dying, all that kind of thing. And it was most often the women and the older women and the weaker women, the less powerful women, who bore the brunt of that blame, really.
Yeah, I was just trying to think of a writer. Somebody said, "I don't believe in ghosts, but I live in a haunted house." So.
Yes.
Always just in the back of your mind.
Yes.
So talking about the women and their skills. 200 years ago, a lot of women were incredibly skilled in the use of herbs and potions for healing injuries and curing illnesses. But of course, they were quite rightly frightened of being accused of witchcraft at the time. What did that mean for a woman at the time if she was accused of witchcraft?
At the time I'm writing, the laws had been repealed, so you couldn't hang a woman or a person for witchcraft, but they would be shunned by the town or the village and cast out. Their life would be made very difficult, and yet they would struggle to earn a living as well. And often the women who were herbalists were older women. Maybe they're on their own, and they really, that's their only source of income. Yes, it was very difficult, and people were naturally still very superstitious. I think superstition takes a long time to disappear from a culture.
And yet those women who were skilled in the use of potions and herbs were often very sought after, weren't they? Because they could actually do something to help people with illnesses or injuries. So that must have been a strange dichotomy.
Yes, I think they were very well sought after until something went wrong, and then they were blamed.
And then they were blamed. Yeah. Well, yeah. And talking about the dresses, so the trend at the time, I think, was for designers to include, as you said, very traditional, beautiful sort of cottage garden flowers or more traditional flowers on their fabrics. So in the story, why does Mary Louise decide to experiment with, as you said, weeds or common blooms or poisonous plants? And then why was that dangerous once she started to do that?
Her sister gives her a book that details some of these plants, and that piques her interest. She also wants to do something different. She wants to set herself apart. And then she designs the fabric with some of these plants, and then she takes them to a weaver who's fairly disaffected as well, because her husband has been thrown out by the Guild of Weavers. And so I like to think that between the two of them, some sort of alchemy takes place, that then this fabric, you can choose to believe, and I leave it up to the reader, can choose to believe that this fabric actually has sort of ill intent woven into it.
But regardless of whether it does or not, it's a bit frowned upon that she would even think to do that, isn't it? It's very unusual that she would use these sort of dangerous plants or common plants rather than the more traditional.
Yes. From my research, that's what I found, that it was much more common to have roses and peonies and all those kind of flowers used in a design. Yeah.
When you were researching, did you find any evidence of people who did use the more common plants or dangerous poisonous plants?
What I did find was that there were things like sheaves of wheat woven into a design, that if it was for a particular person who had that association, and sometimes little animals, bees and things like that. So so there was definitely some of it as well.
I love the animals on the dresses that she designs. There's bees and there's a little spider. Yeah, that's a beautiful touch. Yeah.
Thank you.
So the old silk house in the contemporary part of the story is a school boarding house, and you were a boarding student yourself. So how did your experience of being a boarding student inform your writing of this novel?
Really that it's quite a closed society, and you're quite isolated. Even though this boarding house is in the main street, it's very much self-contained. And you don't tend to mix with people from the outside world, and so it's just very contained, which I quite liked the idea of. And it also comes with any number of archaic rules and rituals. And at the boarding school I went to, we had a ceremony it must have been in October or November, called the Boar's Head, and we paraded around the boarding house with a pig's head on a platter before a big dinner. It was a boar's head dinner, and it was roasted, I think, and we sang this boar's head song, which is a really old kind of traditional song. And so just bizarre, traditions like that, I think, are quite fascinating. Yeah.
Well, you've managed to incorporate quite a few of those into the story, which is really interesting.
Good.
I found a quote where you said, I'm very interested in the way that events, particularly traumatic ones, can leave their mark on a place, years, even centuries after the people involved have died. The way that history is a layering process with memories and experiences layered into the fabric of a building. Why do you think buildings or stately old homes hold such powerful memories?
I just think they absorb the energy, which is very kind of Northern Rivers woo-woo of me. But I remember a couple of years ago doing a ghost tour at the quarantine station in Manly, late night one, sort of 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. And we walked into some of the buildings and I felt really uncomfortable in some of those buildings. There was the shower rooms, and then there was a bathroom at the back of a sort of hut, and I had to get out of there, and I couldn't have told you why. So I think definitely things have an energy about them where, particularly if something terrible has happened, they seem to, I know a lot of people who visited Port Arthur say that too has a real eeriness about it. Yes, so I firmly subscribe to that view.
And do you think that particularly with very old buildings, that layering of so many different lives over the years, lives over lives over lives, people who've lived there, can really sort of seep into the bones of the structure, I guess.
Definitely, yes. And for me, that's where history comes alive in things you can touch. And imagine somebody having lived there several hundred years before, and what went on between, those walls just is fascinating to me.
Yeah, that's one of the most interesting things about the story, I think, is the house itself, and how you keep going back from what it was then to what it is now. And, you talk about the same rooms and the same walls and the same doorways, and you can, it is the same house, and yet it is such a different time and such different people living there.
Yes, yeah. No, and I really enjoy books where you do have the past and the present, and a story happening in each that have that common sort of venue, I suppose, or common location. It really brings it
reminded me a little bit of Kate Morton's work, actually. She does that a lot too, doesn't she, with the historical and the contemporary narrative sort of threaded together.
Yeah.
Now, this is an interesting question. As part of your mother's role as an ordained Anglican minister, she undertook training in exorcisms, which is a bit out there.
It is.
So how did that affect your interpretation of the more ghostly aspects of the story?
At the time, I remember being interested and asking her to tell me about it, but I wish I'd asked more questions. She's not alive anymore. But she would talk about going often to houses where people were quite emotionally disturbed, and that it was having an effect on their surroundings, and they were convinced that there was something in the house. She was kind of on the fence as to whether it was something in their emotional psyche that was causing some of these issues. And so she thought that a lot of her job was just reassuring people and kind of cleansing a place, but really it was about reassuring the people who were experiencing these things. She did say there was one, maybe two occasions where she felt like she was in the presence of pure evil. And she said she just got out of there. She was, it was way above her pay grade. And she referred it on, because in the Church of England there, and I think in the Catholic Church as well, there is this, they have a division, it's called the Ministry of Deliverance. And it's about delivering people from evil spirits. So I'd always wanted to kind of somehow include something about that in a novel. So it was really, really good that it just seemed to flow naturally into this book.
And it does flow naturally. And there is a difference between, I think, the haunting or the presence of something in a house as opposed to the presence in a person. Like traditionally we think of an exorcism, I suppose, as being from a person, a spirit taking an evil spirit from a person, but this is more about the presence of it in a place.
An unquiet spirit or two.
An unquiet spirit.
Yes.
Yeah. So in this story, the three main women characters, Rowan, Thea, and Mary Louise, are all in their own ways quite strong women, I think, despite coming from very different circumstances and times. And I really thought that this book is a celebration about how each of them followed their ambitions and stood fast by their beliefs to achieve what they wanted. Why is it important for you to write strong female characters?
I think it's important to write strong characters generally. A reader will be far more invested in a character that has agency and is going to do something to affect the story and not be passive. So that's really important. I think it's important to celebrate and to showcase that there are women, and you know, they're loosely based on some women I know, or just little bits of them that you know, are perfectly capable of all these kinds of things, really. Yes, and have, you know, history has shown that they are, but the way history has been recorded might not necessarily lead you to think that. And it's also about that, you know, in centuries past, a woman's job was to have babies, to continue the family line, to procreate. And I think this book touches on it. I was quite interested in the tropes, the traditional tropes of mother, maid, crone, and I wanted to kind of play with those. And in Thea, in the contemporary story, is kind of a stand-in mother for the girls in her care, that kind of thing. So it was nice to kind of have a few layers of that happening as well.
And also, I think interesting too, the comparisons between the expectations of what a woman might expect to achieve 200 years ago, or what sort of ambitions she might have had then, compared to Thea's ambitions and expectations now, you know, which
yes, and obviously there's a huge difference. And you know, centuries ago a woman couldn't own property unless she was a widow. She couldn't have her own money, all those kind of things. And if she had you know, a job, it was very much within the confines of the house, or particularly if she was married. But also I wanted to kind of highlight that there still are prejudices against women even today, and that's what I think having this first intake of girls into a boarding school shows. Most boarding schools in England now are co-ed, but where at the time I was going to school and my brother and sister were, they were some of the first people. My sister was one of the first girls to go to an all boys boarding school. And actually another writer, Joanna Nell, read this, quite an early version, and she was like, oh my goodness, I was one of 14 girls in a boys' boarding school, and some of the buildings were haunted. And
You've written her story.
I know. Well, it was quite funny because she said, "No," and I was a scholarship girl, and I said I had a scholarship girl for a narrative thread, but just to tighten the story up, it had to kind of go on the cutting room floor. So that was really kind of like quite mind-boggling.
Truth is stranger than fiction. Stranger than fiction. And Thea, the contemporary story with Thea, I mean, even though she obviously has a lot more rights and advantages than Rowan and Mary Louise, she still comes across misogyny and, you know, difficult expectations in her workplace. I guess partly because it is traditionally a boys' school, but just as part of normal society too.
Yes, and also some of the characters in that boarding school would have been there for decades and expected to have things done a certain way, and couldn't cope with the new and the unknown either. And it was, you know, they're afraid of things they don't really understand. But some of them do come round in the end. Yes,
they do. So when you're writing this kind of book that combines the historical and the contemporary, how do you balance those narratives without losing the reader? How do you keep the reader engaged between, you know, a scene set 200 years ago and a scene today, and then we're back to 200 years ago and back to today?
I think as a reader, you can generally hold two separate ideas in your head at one time, sometimes even more, without losing that. And the aim is for each chapter to end at a point where you're desperate to know what happens next, but then you have to read the next chapter, but then you're immersed in that again. For each strand, I write each one separately. Kate Forsyth gave me that very good advice a few books ago, and it really helps. And so, because I want each strand to be equally as valid and tell equally as interesting a story, and not to have one kind of playing second fiddle to the other. So I usually write the historical strand first, so I know what's happened, and then the contemporary strand. And generally the contemporary strand is a way of finding out solving a mystery in the past, as well as containing its own storyline as well.
So you write them separately and then weave them together.
Yeah. Weave them together, and it's easier than you might think. To just, I have each one printed in a different color, and I know what's roughly in each chapter, and I just kind of move them around until I'm happy with the way the story flows. And it can change slightly in the editing process, but generally not too much. Yeah.
And it's true what you said about the cliffhangers at the end of each chapter. I think that really keeps the reader hooked in, because you just get very emotionally invested in Rowan's story, and then something happens and then she's gone and you're on to somebody else. So yeah, that's a really effective technique as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Kate, have all of the books that you've written been inspired by actual objects or things you've seen or people you've read about?
Not so much. My previous book, The Forgotten Leicester of Esther Durrant, not quite as much. That was more inspired by a place. Oh, and possibly a little bit of my family history as well. There was that in there as a little spark. But it tends to sort of, if that's the initial starting point, it ends up kind of somewhere way over here. By the time I've just sat and written for months on end, it's the resulting story is quite different. But it's just, yeah, it can be something like a newspaper article or a painting. I happened to see a painting in the Archibald finalists probably about 4 years ago now by Heidi Yardley. And it's a wonderful painting of a woman wearing a black cloak that's daubed with sort of white chalk-like slogans, and she has a big staff and long grey hair. And I took a photo of that and stuck it in one of my writing notebooks, and I was just like that. There's something really intriguing about this kind of a character that tells me there might be a story in it. And I think once you do begin to write, because before I started writing, I was like, oh, wouldn't know what to write about. I haven't got a single idea. But once you do start tuning in, it's like tuning in an old-fashioned radio. And all of a sudden, there's just ideas come flying at you every day. And then it's a process of sifting and stopping and thinking is, does this have legs? And then sometimes it's combining 2 or 3 ideas to make something as well. And as I'm writing, I think, well, okay, well, this is the kind of story I want to tell, and these are the themes I'm interested in, although sometimes they don't emerge until the end of the first draft either.
And then, so how do you decide, once you've got all these brilliant ideas floating around in your head, how do you decide which ones you're going to really intensively research or spend your time, how do you decide what you're going to spend your time on?
I have a big whiteboard, and so I start to think of it like that, and I just start making notes, I suppose, as well, or just on a Word document of things I'm thinking about. And then I delve into the research in terms of historical research about the times. So what people wore, what they ate, how they lived, what their sanitation was like, all those kind of things I want to know. So I know what they would have been doing, all the really basic historical information. And once I've got that, I can kind of see some characters in a landscape. And I suppose I write to find out what's happening, what's going to happen to them, what might happen to them. I usually have a few tent poles of ideas along the way of events that I think might happen, but I can't plan it all out, because for me, the most interesting discoveries come as I'm writing.
So this is a very personal writer's question from a writer, but how do you know when to stop researching and just get on and write the story? Do you have a point where you go, okay, I've done enough, I need to just...
Usually when I can see the first scene in my head and almost see it like a movie, and I'm like, okay, well, I can start writing the first scene. And then I might be writing for a few hours a day, and then I'll go back to doing some more research. And particularly if there are things that I need to find out as I go. So I'm kind of immersed in that world from a writing perspective and from a research perspective. I think for The Botanist's Daughter, I did about 3 or 4 months of research and reading before I started writing. And then probably the same for The Silk House, yes. So about that amount of time.
So do you think that that's the main difference between historical writing and contemporary writing, is the research aspect? Or do you think that there's a whole range of differences in how, or are there more similarities than differences?
Oh, I don't know. You need that extra layer of research to really, the worst thing you can do is to, yank your reader out of the story because they're like, oh, well, this wouldn't happen in that time. And, they wouldn't have taken the train there because there were no trains at that time, that kind of thing. So it's really important to get that detail right. And I think also that kind of detail brings the world to life. And it's noticing the really little things, like, in a dress, they would have had pockets on a string in the 18th century on a string around their waist. It's knowing those kind of details. It's like, what sort of shoes did they wear? Did they have a buckle? Or, when were shoelaces invented? All those little tiny details that I think as a writer of historical fiction, you have to be aware of and be thinking about and be interested in as well.
And are they things that you seek out intentionally, or are they things that you've sort of collected along the way of your, they're just up there in your head of interesting facts that you...
A bit of both, actually. Yes, definitely a bit of both. Yeah. But often if I'm writing a scene and I'm like, well, how long would it take to get from this part of the country to the other? And then I have to stop and think and go and try and find it out to be able to include it. Yeah.
So if you had to give one piece of advice to writers who are struggling with an historical story, what would that be? What would your main piece of advice be?
It depends what they're struggling with, really. If they're struggling, I don't know, that it's hard to be very general. I think find an era that really excites you and interests you. I think definitely. And find some characters and some events that you find intriguing and start thinking of a story based around those, perhaps.
Great advice. Kate, Emma Kate, not Kate, we've got a Kate, we've got an Emma Kate, I'm getting confused. Emma Kate, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. We've got a couple. The first one is from Ika. Ika says, I'm interested in the design of your book cover. How did this come about? It's so beautiful.
Oh, thank you, Ika. I'm very lucky in that my publisher, Rebecca Saunders, is extremely good at covers, I think, very good at covers. I'm lucky enough that she really includes me quite early on in the process. I might send her some ideas I'm thinking of, some images that I've come across, and once she's briefed and we talk about some of the words in the text as well, and she often highlights some of the sentences, and then we send it to the cover designer, and when we get quite a few options that come back, and she's really good about sharing those with me and knows I won't freak out if there's nothing that is right, and so it's quite a collaborative process between the three of us. I was really keen to have a black background for this cover, and we had a few options because I just think it really helps hint at the darkness there. But it's also, from a very commercial point of view, it's quite important to have covers that look in the same family as your previous books. And so these three historical titles really do, they share a kind of common DNA, and that just helps for reader recognition as much as anything. But I really do, I love all the detail in this cover.
The detail is beautiful, actually. I don't know if people haven't actually seen the book in the flesh yet. There's a key there, which is an important part of the story. There's a little apothecary sort of medicine bottle. There's a needle and thread down here. There's lots of really gorgeous, interesting details. And I believe that all the plants, are they all sort of poisonous plants that are featured in there?
Not necessarily, but there are poppies which are mentioned.
And there's the red berries.
Yes, the rowan berries, and I'm not sure about the dandelion, but I think that's more part of the kind of just the weeds and the flowers of the byways and the fields. Yeah, so no, I love the process of covers. When I was a magazine editor, that was one of my favorite jobs, was working with a designer on a magazine cover every month. So I'm really happy that I get to do this again.
It's a beautiful cover.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. We have another question from Gemma. Gemma says, Silk House is incredibly gothic in its writing style. Was this a new style for you? And will you write other books in this style?
I'm not sure if I will write other books in this style. The book I've written that's now with my publisher, hopefully for next year, is quite different, but shares other common things with my writing. But it just seemed that this story lent itself to that kind of tone, and that slightly creepy, not quite knowing exactly what's going on, sort of feeling, I guess. So that's why it has those gothic overtones, but it's not something I will continue to explore, well, certainly not for the next book anyway.
And Gemma also wanted to know, what's your favourite period of history to write about?
The one I'm currently writing about, I think the one I'm currently researching. Each time I'm like, oh no, this is really fascinating. Yeah, I don't have one particular favourite. The book I've written for next year is set in the Second World War in Burma, and that's it's a time period that's absolutely fascinating to me, and a lot of other writers as well, and readers. But to actually have researched something set in Burma, I found, because I really didn't know very much about the war there at all. So that was really interesting. It's when I'm learning new things, I think that's when I go, oh, this is a really interesting time to have lived. Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. We've got one more question here from Margaret, who says, Kate, I adore your books. Do you find it difficult to leave the book you've just worked on and start the new one? You must become so close to your characters. Is it hard to leave them behind?
Oh, thank you, Margaret. Those are lovely words. I do become quite close to the characters, yes. And actually in next year's book, I had to kill off one of my characters, and I had to go for a very long walk on the beach because I was quite upset by it. And I was like, have I done the right thing? So yes, it is quite hard to leave the book behind. And I usually have, if I have time, at least a few weeks where I can just go and do something, do other things and do some admin and maybe clean my house and those kind of things. So I'm not really thinking about a new book necessarily quite straight away. I'm not one of those writers that can, finish a book on a Friday and start a new one on a Monday. I wish I was.
Who are those writers?
I think Nora Roberts. Yes, Nora Roberts, apparently. That's how she's so prolific. Yes. But yes, I do become fond of the character. You have to be. You're living with them. You're thinking about them. It's the thing I think about when I go to sleep at night. It's the thing I'm thinking about the minute I wake up in the morning. My characters are there with me if I'm right in the thick of writing, for sure.
Did you have a favorite character in this book?
I liked them all, but I think definitely Thea. She's she was. Yeah, whereas I did also quite like the Dame. She was quite fun to write.
Yes, that would have been fun. Yes,
yeah.
A lot of fun with her. And Kate, I think most writers find that they sort of are continually circling back to writing about the same themes, even if they're writing very different books set in very different times. They tend to write about the same themes. Do you find that?
It's becoming apparent to me, definitely. And I think the themes are about women and their agency or the lack of it at various points in history, and the particular struggles they have to overcome. I think that's definitely of interest to me, and I hope it's of interest to the readers as well. Yeah. And then there are other things, minor things, like I'm very interested in herbs and flowers and potions, and that something growing in your back garden can have these amazing properties, but you just don't really know about it. You don't have the knowledge to extract that. So that's a kind of an abiding interest as well. Yeah.
So the book that Rowan has in the story, the book of, I can't remember what it's called, the book of, you can't either. It's a book of, full of all the information about plants and their properties and what they can be used for. Is that information still used in parts of the world, do you know?
Oh, I don't know. I know that it's a real book because I Googled it and I needed to find a book that was around at that time. Probably the knowledge would have been built on, but that, could well have been the basis. I think a lot of the knowledge about plants goes back a long way, for sure.
There must have been a lot of trial and error in the beginning, mustn't it?
Indeed.
Especially with poisonous plants, without, how much is just enough to help without,
exactly,
without killing someone or making the problem worse.
Yes, for sure. Yes, there would have been. Yeah.
And there's a lot in the story about not just about curing illnesses, but also for injuries. So poultices for I think someone's kicked by a horse at one point, and different injuries like that.
Yes, and for bruises and even herbs could be used in teas to soothe the digestion, or all kinds of things, because in those times most of them couldn't afford to go to a doctor or the barber surgeon, as they were often known, and they had to rely on, and they had no money for medicines, so they couldn't often go to the apothecary. Occasionally they could, but so they relied on kind of local wisdom and things that had been knowledge that had been handed down for generations, really. Yeah.
I think that whole idea about the botany and the women that had that knowledge remind me a lot of Lauren Chater's book, Gulliver's Wife, and she's written about the midwives of that time, around that time as well.
I really enjoyed reading that. As I was reading it, I was like, oh, we should have talked about the research we were doing.
We should have collaborated.
Around similar times and, you know, slightly different but very similar topics. Yeah.
But that's so interesting that those women, and they were really all women, were so skilled and so knowledgeable and so useful and so sought after by people when they had problems. But as you said, until something went wrong, and then they were blamed, and it was witchcraft.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I remember Lauren saying that in a birth, they had a lot of people who would sit around and watch the birth just to sort of bear witness to the fact that the midwife wasn't doing anything dangerous to the child.
Yes. The gossips, they were called.
The gossips,
yes, I thought that was really interesting. Yes, definitely. So, I guess they needed their own protection, and that's the form it came in, for sure.
And yet they continue to do it, which really says something about, I guess, the calling that they felt to be a herbalist or to be a healer. You know, it must have been like a vocation.
Yeah, as it is for people nowadays. For some people, that really is a calling for them as well. Yes, definitely. Yeah.
True. Emma Kayte, do we have any more questions there or not at the moment? No, I can't hear you, Emma Kayte. You're
Sorry,
on mute.
I didn't realise I was on mute there. We don't at the moment, no. So if you want to continue, Kat,
we'll just keep chatting.
We can, but if you have any more questions, everybody, then please do send them over.
In the chat function. So tell me more about this new book set in Burma. Did you go to Burma before COVID?
No, I
didn't.
Any research? Unfortunately, no, I couldn't travel there. And I also kind of figured that if I'm writing about it in the 1940s, it would probably be fairly different than it is now. So I looked at a lot of old photographs on the internet, and part of the book is also set in Ireland in the year 1999, just before the New Year's of the 2000, and I had been to Ireland, so I was able to write that with absolute first-hand experience, which was good. But I was able to talk to some of the women who served there. Well, there's one woman who's still alive, and that was just invaluable. To find out about what it was like, what life was like there for her as well. And there's not much that's known about it, but I did find a handful of diaries and a few letters and some oral histories from the Imperial War Museum in England. They've got a fantastic oral history database, and you can listen to people saying things in their own words, particularly around what happened in the war. So that's a really useful resource.
So getting back to the Silk House, tell me about some of the minor characters that are in this book, because there's so many fascinating characters. Patrick is a real character. Tell us a little bit about him.
I wanted to make him one of those people who kind of believe their own bullshit. And I think I'd watched the Fire Festival on Netflix. You know, that crazy festival that those people thought they could put together.
Yes.
And I was like, there are some people who just think if they say it with enough conviction, it'll happen. And so I was quite interested in making him a bit of a character like that, and a bit of a gambler and unreliable. There's one scene where Rowan witnesses him at a cockfight, and she sees him in a totally different way. And in terms of researching that, I think one day I was looking at videos on YouTube of cockfights, and that was really quite horrific in terms of research. So he was a very interesting character
because he doesn't start off as terrible. I mean, at the beginning of the book, you think he's okay, but it's as the book progresses that you realise.
There's a few hints. There's a few little hints at the beginning that he might not be telling the truth about things. So he was really interesting to write. And then there's the Dame Hicks.
Yes.
And actually, in the book Rebecca, there's Mrs. Danvers. who is this kind of spectral character, and particularly in the movie, she's really quite terrifying. And so I had that in the back of my mind of having her as a similar character. And she wants to help Thea, but she's also kind of quite no nonsense and a little bit more than a little mysterious. When I was thinking of her name, I found the name of the last woman, I think, hanged for witchcraft in England, and so I gave her that name. And similarly with some of the girls, some of the names, Aradia, Aradia, Sabrina, Morgan, are all female names associated with witches. And so that was kind of fun, just to add in that little bit of detail as well, and another layer to it.
Because that's one of the great things about the book, is that mysterious feeling right from the beginning. So particularly with Thea's storyline, is that she's gone to this house, she's in this entirely new situation, and there's all these sort of very subtle things that are happening that could be nothing. It could be her imagination.
Yes. But exactly, I wanted to play on that she's not quite sure whether to be freaked out or not, and you know, fire alarms going off in the middle of the night, or the cat screeching and yowling, you know, a plague of ants in the tea, and just or moths and that kind of thing. And then there are sort of more sinister things like the piles of sawdust that keep appearing,
little piles of dirt in her room.
Yes, that she thinks is sawdust but aren't. Yes, yeah. So that was fun, really fun to play with those.
And looking at it from her perspective as a modern woman, you know, of course, you're looking at it through the lens of, well, obviously there's got to be an explanation for this. There has to be a rational explanation for why there are, you know, obviously there's ants, you know, bringing sawdust in through the, you know, there's termites or something.
Yes, so, exactly. Yeah, she's
that
trying to explain it to herself rationally. Yes, yeah, exactly. And also I wanted the reader to not really know either. It's like, well, is she imagining it, or, you know, is this, or does this all have a logical explanation? Because it absolutely could. And it's again that question in the reader's mind as to, you know, what's really going on here. And I didn't want to be too heavy-handed about it either, and too kind of sinister and making it, you know, too obvious.
Yeah, no, it's done with a very light touch, and I think you achieve that. I think that as a reader, you sort of go along with this story, and you kind of think, well, that's a bit strange, or it's a bit weird, but surely it must have an explanation. And then you get to something else and you think, oh, that's a bit weird too, but you know, it could have an explanation. That's why I was so interested in looking at Thea versus the women in the 1700s, because I think back then the people would have been more likely to go, that's definitely witchcraft, or it's definitely
they would have been throwing their salt over their shoulder left, right and centre.
Yes. Whereas today, with Thea's storyline, she's much more likely to think scientifically about it and to try and work out why this thing is happening.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it was nice to have that contrast as well. Yeah.
And then I've just forgotten the name of the boy who's kicked by the horse.
Tommy.
Tommy. Tell us a little about Tommy.
I wanted a really, not too much of a romance, but just a nice, sweet little love story in there as well. And he came along, and you know, it was perfect for Rowan, and also for by the end the reader finds out what happens to Rowan. And you know, sort of, she's got her whole storyline that happens as well. That's
a quite beautiful part to the story, is that because you've got the two narratives, then and now, you can see, or Thea can see, she can research, and as she's a historian herself, she can research and find out what happened to those people who lived at that time, which I think is a lovely, sort of closes the circle. It's a lovely way to finish the book and sort of resolve the book.
Yeah, and it was interesting, there were some things that only came to me right at the very end of the first draft, and there's a little bit of a twist in the book, and it wasn't until I reached the end of the first draft I was like, oh my goodness, of course. And then I had to go back and kind of reverse engineer a few things, but I was like, why didn't I see this until I was writing it? So I was almost as surprised as I hope the reader will be when you get towards the end of the book.
Well, they say if you're surprising yourself when you're writing, that you're sure to surprise your reader. So I'm sure that probably will happen with people.
Dear, yes. But it's interesting, with everything like that as a writer, you have to make it logical. You can't just have things happen out of thin air because the reader won't believe it and they'll just go, yeah, right, whatever. So there has to be that step by step. That when you go back, you think, oh yes, it would. The breadcrumbs were there all along. The clues were there, and I love those kind of books particularly. So yeah, that was fun to do.
Well, look, I absolutely loved this book. If you're watching and you haven't read it yet, do buy a copy. It's a sort of book that I think will be very widely popular. It's got a bit of everything. It's got a bit of little, as you said, a little bit of romance, a lot of mystery, a little bit of haunting. All of the information about the botanicals and the plants is fascinating. The silk designing, I think, is just so interesting. The process of designing the patterns and the weaving and all of the work that went into that, is gorgeous. So congratulations
thank you
on the story.
Thank you, Cass.
It's a great
Thank
read.
you very much. And thank you to everybody for coming and listening. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry I can't see all of your faces in person, but it's fantastic that you are all able to tune in and come along.
Yeah, and thank you so much to you, Kate and Cass, for a fantastic discussion. I'm going to unmute everybody shortly. Do either of you have any final comments that you want to make beforehand?
I don't think so. No.
No?
I do. Just buy multiple copies of this book from Avid Reader. Multiple copies. Tell your friends.
Tell your friends.
For your mother, your sister, your brother, your best friend. Yes, great idea.
It's a good winter holiday read as well. You can kind of curl up on a rainy afternoon and read it.
Absolutely. Yes. The Silk House.
Lovely, thank you. I've posted that link in the chat again, and I'm going to unmute you all now so that you can join me in thanking Cass and Kate. There we go. Everybody's off mute. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That was a great
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. That was great.
Thanks.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.